Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey My Mother's Son podcast. Today I'm joined with fellow Berks County native and author Heather Christie. Heather, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Just before we get started, though, introduce yourself in your own words. Who is Heather today?
So my tagline on my website is writer, producer, educator. Yeah, some all those things, but I'm a mom too, and I'm a New Yorker now. So yeah, I'm a writer. I've written a couple books, and I'm working on this big project, LoveNotes, which I anticipate we're going to talk about
Yeah,
here.
we're going to talk a lot about that. But before we get into the Love Notes project specifically, let's just talk about, writing in general. So Love Notes is your third book. Um, Tell me about, you know, at what point in your life did you aspire to be an author? Because I love, kind of sharing those stories with other authors to understand how the process works. I mean, I know how it took place for me, but like for you, was it something you dreamt of your whole life, or was it something that all of a sudden there was this like aha moment, like, wow, I like writing. I should try to get published.
So for me, it wasn't something I knew that I wanted to do my whole life. I actually started out as a young person, a teenager. I was an actress and I was on a work study. So I grew up in a small rural area, which we both know the Ole Valley. And I would go to school in the morning for 3 periods, and then I would get on a bus and I would head to New York City. And I would go on auditions, go sees. If I had a job and I booked a job, I would do the job. I actually ended up graduating early from high school, and I moved to New York City when I was 17 because I was going to, try to have this big showbiz career. I started out as a creative. I knew I was going to be a creative, and then my life took a big detour. I married young and stayed married a really long time, kind of bumped around the country, ended up back in Berks County, and I was a businesswoman. But it always felt like I wasn't being true to myself. And about 15 years ago, I had a friend who published a book, and I was really inspired by her journey. And I thought, well, I can do that. And my undergraduate degree was in literary studies. So I always really like to read. And so I started kind of like just playing around with writing. And I had this one scene in my head, which actually became the prologue in my first book. But that's all I had was the scene. You'll have to excuse Circe here. This is how I keep her um, behaving if she's on my lap. But I didn't know what to do with it. I was like, but I love school. And so I ended up going back to school and getting a master's of fine arts in creative writing when I was 40. And then the first draft of this book was my master's thesis. So that's kind of how I became a writer, but it feels much more in tune with who I am than like the acting part. But we're going to talk about Love Notes, which is a storytelling show as well as a book. And that's a really beautiful intersection for me, like those two things kind of coming together. So it brings like kind of my past and what I evolved into together. Yeah, but I wasn't one of these people that was like from the time they're 6 years old, like, oh, I know I want to be a writer. Like I didn't know that. I didn't know
Right.
that till a lot later in life.
I think the beautiful part about that is it just lets the listeners know that it's never too late to change directions and to follow your passion. And again, I mean, we don't always know what our passion is when we're 20 years old or 24 years old or 30 years old or even 40 years old many times. I mean, if you would have told me when I was 40 years old that in another 15 years or so, my wife would be selling our house and all of our stuff and jumping in an RV and, driving around the country, I'd have said, there's no way that's going to happen. That was my mom's story. It wasn't my story. It wasn't something I aspired to do. I wasn't passionate about that. I was passionate about what I was doing at that time. So I think, there's an underlying beauty in that, at some point when you feel that tug, regardless of where you're at in life, go ahead and follow it. So, to go back to school at 40 years old, that point, you know, already a mom, I'm assuming,
And
um,
I was running Berkshire Hathaway.
right.
I was
Very
the
successful.
I
I
was
mean,
operations manager at Berkshire Hathaway. So I was kind of like juggling a lot of different things. But yeah, I think like to your point, somebody said something to me one time, like when you're trying to sort of figure out what's right, is like follow the energy points, right? Like so many times we sort of resist, but like if you just sort of just follow the energy, like and see where it takes you.
yeah,
And like you were saying, like it's never too late to begin again. Like we can reinvent ourselves as many times as we want to, right?
yes, I
I
love
mean, a
that.
lot of times we feel like we can't because we're like in certain relationships or jobs or right. But those are just stories we tell ourselves. And as a storyteller, I've had to take a look at that a lot, even in my own life. Like, what are the stories I tell myself and how are they constricting me? And then how to like relearn and retell and reinvent and write new chapters and things like that in our lives.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, we are all storytellers. Just some of us identify with it better than others because, like you said, every one of us is telling our own stories in our own heads as to what we can, and unfortunately, too many times, what we cannot do. So I think as we all discover that storyteller within us, we need to really look at, like what you said, the stories we're telling ourselves even more so than the stories we're telling others. So after you published book number one, um, was there an immediate desire to like, okay, this is who I am now. I am a writer. I'm an author. I'm working on book number two right away, or did it take a little bit of time to start working on number two?
No, once I sort of fell into writing, I felt really connected. This might sound a little woo woo, but I think like as we find our passions, and it's like, where do you feel the divine? Like, where does that show up in your life? And that's where I felt kind of the most connected to whatever this is that we're doing here on Earth. Um, and so I knew, but at the same time, I'm still juggling a lot of balls. I'm working. I always worked full time. I have two kids, and I ended up going through a divorce uh, 5 years ago. And but I knew I had the second story, and both of these stories are really familiar to people in Berks County because I use a fictional town called Millington Valley, which is the composite of a lot of different town, like the Ole Valley, Fleetwood, the Sinking Spring area. So I had the second story in my head. It took me 8 years to write the first one and to get a publisher to publish it. And then the second one came out a lot faster, though. I knew that story. I knew I was able to plot it a lot faster. So I did know, yeah, I knew, but still, and as you know, like being a creative or an artist, there's always this conflict between our art and like you still have to make a living,
Right.
or most of us do. And juggling those things. But yes, I did know that book was coming and coming faster. And then I sort of went through this big life change 5 years ago and ended up, my children launched and I ended up relocating to New York City. And so this book came out a little slower. And this is, I sort of had to settle. I had to sort of like resettle myself. And this book is just not written by me. It's a collection of stories, which we can talk more about that. I don't want to hijack the way you're directing the conversation. But the answer to your question was the second book came out faster than the first one. And
Yeah.
plus, you get better as a writer. You learn how to plot. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's very similar. I mean, my first book, it took me 9 years to write. And then I often joke because I ended up then originally published it in 2012 and then republished it in 2021 with 10 new chapters. So I'll tell people like, look, if you're struggling with the writing process or thinking it's too long, like really at the end of the day, it took me 18 years in total to publish book number one. But then, like I said, book two came out the following year and really actually 2 years later. And really the only reason for that kind of time lapse was because it was really written in a journal form of the
Mhm.
first 18 months of us traveling and the 6 months leading up to us selling everything and kind of launching on this crazy journey that we've been on. But the writing itself came much quicker. It was just that, again, the way it was written, was a chronological journal in essence. And then the second two came out very quickly at that point. So yeah, I think anybody that's listening to us that's, kind of up against that wall thinking, they've started their book and they're only 5 chapters in and they don't think it's ever going to end. It's like just keep going. Doesn't matter how long it takes you to get there. And once you get
Right.
there, just understand that that first one, you know, is the one that breaks the ice. And I just heard we were at a conference the other week, and I just heard that only 3% of people that actually start writing a book actually finish it. And that was something that made me feel very proud at the point at that point, because I'm in a room with other, so many other authors where you're looking around and you're like, oh, I'm just like everyone else here has a book. But then when you hear that statistic, you're like, wait, that's a pretty significant accomplishment to be one of 3% of the people that have actually started and finished. So gave me kind of a proud moment there for sure. So um yeah, it's I think just trusting that process is important. I mean, during that first book, I mean, were there points where you were frustrated and thinking it was taking too long, or were you comfortable with how the timeline was going for you?
Well, like I said, it was part of my master's thesis. So, and I had a whole uh I went out on sub with this, like to get an agent, because we got very close to having this picked up by a big five publisher. At the end of the day, it didn't, it went to a small indie publisher. But the, yes, like I thought I had this book finished and had went out on submission for agents, and I had gotten pretty good feedback. I had 10 agents require the full manuscript, and then all of them passed, except one. One said, well, this is what I think you need to do with the book. And if you do that, I'll take a look at it again. So that, yeah, I mean, it was hopeful, but at the same time, I was like, oh my gosh, this has already been so much work. But at that point, I ended up hiring a developmental editor, and her name's Sandra Schofield. She had won the National Book Award. And so she was a really vigorous, challenging editor. And she got my first manuscript and she's like, well, this is a mess. But I worked with her for a year and got the book to the point where I felt I was ready to send it back to that first agent. And in the meantime, I had gone to the New York Pitch Conference, which is like American Idol for authors. You go in and you pitch your book, and they have publishers and there, and they will request, if they're interested, they'll request to see the manuscript. And when I was there, I had two publishers, Simon and Schuster and Penguin Random House, both request the manuscript. But the catch, the paradox is they still won't see it without an agent. But that gave me a little ammunition to go back to that agent and said, hey, I know you, I don't even know if you remember me, but you said a year ago you'd reread my manuscript if I rewrote it. And I have these two publishers that have expressed some interest. And she said, of course. She's like, send it. So, and she had actually, I had sent it to her before that. And that was kind of like my hook to try to follow up. And she did come back. She says, yes, I've been reading it and I want to sign you. So, but yes, I did feel like giving up several times. And then once we went out on submission, we were out on submission for like close to 2 years before we finally, got a deal. Yes, you feel it. It's soul crushing. The actual traditional publishing route can be soul crushing.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but you can't give up, My mentor, the one thing she did say to me, the woman I ended up hiring, and then what was really felt like a great growth as a writer is when my second book came along, I wanted to hire her again. And she said, well, Heather, she's like, you've grown so much as a writer. She says, I won't allow you to hire me. She says, instead, what I'd like us to do is she was working on a novel too. And she says, I'll give you feedback if you give me feedback. And so that felt really good.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So now let's talk about the project that was just released. We brushed on it a little bit because this is so much more than just a book. So tell me a little bit about, where did LoveNotes come from, and where is it headed? Because this is truly, pages and stages all wrapped up in one.
Yeah. So Love Notes came out of like a really dark time in my life. Like I explained, I'd gone through a divorce. and had moved here and was dating and had met someone I really was kind of crazy about. And it turned out he wasn't, we weren't on the same page. So I, I, I was sort of like in this really dark place where I'm like, I don't understand love. Like, I don't understand it. What does it look like? And it came to me because I had produced this other storytelling show called Listen to Your Mother, which is stories about motherhood, but it's somebody else's production. And as a business person, like I knew I wanted something I could try to build. And I can't say when the moment hit me, but I was like, well, I want to find stories that are about real love, like real people saying like, this is what it looks like. And so I put the call out to say, and I knew I wanted it to be more than just a storytelling show because I am, a writer. I knew I wanted it to be a book. And then I'm going to launch a LoveNotes podcast in 2025. So that's sort of how it came about. So we did the first show. So I put the call out. I said, do you have a real a love story, a true story? And we had a really great response for people sharing their stories. And we did the first show last February at the Center at West Park, which is a off-Broadway theater here in New York City. And we had a great response. We had over like 350 people come to the show. So that was really encouraging. And then, but I still needed more stories to put the book together. And so I, put out on different writing sites. So more people submitted stories. And so anyway, so the book, which I'm really super proud of, because this I had to take from like designing, like the whole thing. It's different than these books where as the author, I got to have some input on the cover and things like that. But this one was like my concept. So it was designing the book and then editing every story. So I'm the editor on this book, but I also write the first story. And I created, and I'll try to show you, like there are, so I think of this book as like Chicken Soup for the Soul meets like an activity book / journal.
Okay.
So you have like the stories are the foundation of the book. These are true stories and they're all short. So they're easy to read. Like it's really accessible. Even if you just like put one, on your coffee table or in your bathroom, like you can read them in a few minutes. But then there are journal prompts that go along with the stories that have, sort of, it's like in reflection, like you've read the story and now like, how did this apply to your own life? And then quotes. And then I designed, which I found really fun, all these different kind of love puzzles. So you can read a story, do a little puzzle. It's interactive. The book is interactive. So this was just released in November. And my hope is to be able to do an edition every year. And then to do more specialized editions like LoveNotes, Heartbreak Survival Guide, stories of hope and healing after disappointment, divorce, and death. Another one might be LoveNotes Dating Diaries, like stories of first dates, last dates, and all those dates in between. So that's kind of like the concept for the book and the show. And then the podcast, and I deliberately made the podcast the last thing I would do because I wanted to have the fodder, like all the stories I could start to mine
Right.
as I roll into the podcast. And then the other thing is I created a license for other cities to bring LoveNotes to their communities. So we do have Indianapolis and Chicago launching this year. So Indianapolis is January 31st and Chicago is February 1st. So I'm looking for, if any of your listeners have ideally, if you have a theater background, it's great, but you don't have to. But if they're like, what's this all about? Maybe I'd want to bring a LoveNotes to my town. They can get in touch with me. And there's a whole program, a coaching program and things like that. And it's very affordable to do. And
That's
it's
very cool.
fun. It's really fun.
It's very cool. So the stories that are in the book, they're all people that you just kind of put out a
Yeah,
A
so there's
call for
all different,
submission, so to speak.
yeah, there's different places you can put out calls for submissions, like, New York Playwrights. Writers have all these different groups, and yeah, so that's a big part of it, is like getting the word out about Love Notes and getting people to submit. Like, maybe you want to submit a story next year, for the Love Notes, and or anybody you run into has got a great love story. Tell them like, hey, you should submit for Heather Christie's, Love Notes book in the show. And not everybody who, because sometimes writers, they don't want to get on stage, and there are only 12 spots on stage, whereas the book's got 40 stories. And then this podcast will be 52 stories a year. So there's like different ways people can come into Love Notes.
So are the 12 people that are going to be on stage, are they 12 people from the book, or are they 12 different people?
Well, that's a good question. So this past week we had auditions. So there are going to be, let me think about that. In this edition, I have two people who are in this edition who are going to be in this year's show. Now last year's show, though, I'd say I have 12 of those people are in this book. So there is
Okay.
some overlap, but this show will have at least 10 new people that have not been involved in Love Notes before.
Very
And
cool.
then they'll make up the basis of the next book. But
Very
there'll
cool.
certainly be space available. I'm looking for other stories too for next year's book.
Yeah. And the people that are in the show are the actual people whose story it is, right? It's not an actor
Right.
portraying
No,
their story.
no actors. These are real people. That's the tagline of Love Notes.
Yeah.
It's real stories, real people, real love. Yeah,
Love it.
I mean, some of them have an acting background. Um, some of them are writers, some of them are comedians, some of them are just real people. And yeah, so it's like a wide spectrum of people
Very
who
cool.
audition.
Very cool. So tell me a little bit about the show. It's coming up here in February in a couple months. Is it a one-time production? Does it go on for, a couple
Okay,
weeks or a
so
month, or how's that work?
no. So it's a lot to just get one show off the ground. But so what we're doing is there are going to be two shows on February 15th here in New York City, one a matinee at 3 p.m. and then an 8 p.m. show. But there's also a live stream show. The 8 p.m. show will be live streamed. So for people who are not in New York City or can't get here, they can watch the live stream. There's a live stream ticket. My goal, I would love eventually, as Love Notes grows, to have like a 1 week run, like where we would do like 5 or 6 shows every February, at an off-Broadway theater here in New York. So that's my goal. And, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I love it. So you really are creating like a Love Notes franchise at this point, just continuing to
Trying
build off of
to,
it.
I've worked with a lawyer to trademark it. So we're almost to the end of that process. It's a long process. It's taken like 12 months, but we should have the actual trademark maybe in the next month or two.
Very
And then the
cool.
license for the shows and stuff. Yeah, I'm trying to sort of create like a brand.
Yeah, that's very cool. So what was you know, your feelings? I know you just had these auditions recently. Um, as you're sitting there and kind of listening to these different stories, what was kind of going through your head? I mean, I'm sure there's kind of a proud mama moment, that you're the one who is able to facilitate these people being able to, have the opportunity to tell their stories. Like, what were some of the emotions just going through, as you got to that step?
Well, when I'm actually sitting there in auditions, and I've been on the other side of this too, because like I told you, for years I was an actress, and so I know what it's like to go in and do an audition. It's a really vulnerable thing for the storytellers because they're telling their own story, right? So what I'm looking for as the producer is I want a story that makes me feel something. I either want to laugh, I want to cry, I want to feel inspired, or I want to be able to say, that's really different and interesting. So that's kind of like what I am looking to see, like, what do I feel as I'm listening to these stories? The one really big challenge as the producer trying to put this all together is not every story can go in the show. And I can only have like one dead husband story. I know that sounds horrible, but like a lot of times people will come in and it's like sort of the same theme, and I can only pick one.
Right.
So that's hard because everybody's stories for the most part are good. And then it's, as the producer, it's trying to create this kind of tapestry and ride for the audience. Of these different notes. Like I would say, I actually sort of share, I use kind of like a color coding system as I'm going through auditions. Like each color kind of represents, like I have pink is inspiring, blue is sad, green is funny. Because when I lay it all out, that's what I do then is I kind of lay each story on my living room floor and try to figure out, well, what's the journey going to be like? Not only I do it with the book as well, but the book is a bigger project because I'm trying to create a longer journey, a bigger arc. And I'm also trying to put in the stories, the puzzles, the quotes, and it can't be just jarring for the reader. You've kind of got to create some continuity in
Right.
this sort of narrative arc. But yeah, so when I'm sitting there listening, and I had a panel help me. Yeah, I'm looking for, okay, what makes me feel something?
Right. That's cool. Very cool. So, I mean, we've talked about a bunch of different things throughout the process. Is there anything you think we missed that would be important to the listeners? I know you've got we were talking before we started recording, for our Berks County connection, you've got kind of a special there. So you want to, just talk
Yeah,
about some stuff we might have missed?
we have I have a little sign. I'll hold up. I don't know if you can see it there. We have the LoveNotes bus. One of my best friends organized this, that there's a bus that will come up to the show on February 15th. So it leaves from Joann's Fabrics parking lot in Wyomissing. It's going to leave at 10 in the morning. It'll get you to the city. You'll have time like for lunch or, a little sightseeing. And then it's for the 3 p.m. show. And then it'll leave the city at 8 p.m. So it'll get you back home to Berks County by like 10, probably. The bus fare is only $40 round trip, which is like incredible because like I live here in the Upper West Side in Manhattan, but if I want to go all the way downtown, it can take, if I ride in a cab, it could cost $40.
Right.
So
Easily.
we're gonna bring you to and from Berks County to New York City for $40. Now the ticket for the actual show is not included in the $40. You have to buy your ticket separately. But we do have going on right now, there's an early bird special for the tickets, and you can get 15, they're reduced by 15%, and they range, the regular price is from like $49 to I think it's $74. So you can get your ticket for like $35 or something if you buy it before December 15th. Yeah, so that's the big news for Berks County friends, that they can take we call it the LoveNotes bus. And if anybody's interested in that, they would email, well, you know what? I'll give my information at the end, and then
Yeah.
they could just DM me and I could connect them with my friend Sandy, who's handling the bus.
Perfect. And I'll put all that in the show notes as well when it
Okay,
comes out,
great.
so they'll be able to just click on stuff and make it very easy for them if they want to participate for sure. So
Yeah. And the other thing I would want your audience to know is that I'm looking for stories, right? Because this is going to be like
I
an
love that.
ongoing thing, hopefully an annual book with different editions, and then an annual storytelling show, and then as the podcast launches. So if you have a love story, it needs to be, for the book, it's 1,000 words or fewer. For the stage, it's like 800 words or fewer. But you can submit that. The publisher is, and you can, I guess, put this in the sub notes too. It's 71 Street, STREET, Books, BOOKS.com, 71streetbooks.com. There's a submission button on there, and you can submit your story that way. And then once it comes to me as the editor, I work with people on the stories then.
Awesome. I love it. I love it. So, Heather, how do they find you on the internet if they want to get a copy of the book, they want to get tickets, if they just want to
Right.
reach out to you with their story, how do they find you on the internet?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I have all these different websites that point to me and to LoveNotes and things like that. But the easiest thing to remember is just go to heatherchristiebooks.com, heatherchristiebooks.com. And then you can find LoveNotes there. You can find my other books there. And then there's links to, like, there's a whole LoveNotes page where you can get tickets to the show. You can buy a copy of the book. You can even submit your story that way. It goes directly to me then. Yeah, so it's just www Heather Christie, and my name is spelled CHRISTIE books, BOOKS.com. And then you can, and then I'm on social at the same Heather Christie Books on Facebook, Heather Christie Books on Instagram, and Heather Christie Books on TikTok.
Got it.
Yeah, I'm going to try to start doing TikTok.
Yeah,
I haven't mastered that yet, but I'm going to try. That's going to be like my New Year's resolution.
We're very close in age, and I'm resisting it at all costs. But that conference I was telling you about earlier, that was one of the things. They're like, you got to get out there even if you don't like it. So who knows? Maybe at some point I'll launch something there too. But as of now, I'm still keeping it at arm's length. But we'll see. The technology, it's like a double-edged sword. I mean, all the social media stuff. You need it as an author to get the word out there and get your story out there, but you definitely at times resist it as well. So it's kind of funny how that works.
Yeah, it is a paradox because I'm like a very private person, but yet I have to have this kind of like online personalities that's pushing the books and the shows and all that stuff. So yeah, it's a real kind of paradox to manage.
Yeah, no doubt about that. So, Heather, that brings us to our final question. As you know, the subtitle of the podcast is Many Little People in Many Little Places. So that comes from the opening lyrics of a Michael Franti song, Gloria, which go, when many little people in many little places do many little things and the whole world changes. So it's one of the little things that Heather does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place.
So my mother, she always, everybody complains. It's easy to complain. And my mother taught me, and I've tried to teach my children, is never miss an opportunity to give a compliment. And with that, I'll just say, Dan, I think you've done a wonderful job as podcast host. And thank you very much for having me on your show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And yes, it's those little things like those small compliments that really do go a long way. So great advice from your mom, and I'm glad to hear that you're passing that on to your kids and others as well. So for folks out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com. While you're there, check out our Pay It Forward program where you can pick up a copy of one of my books that Sandy and I will donate throughout our travels. And, again, Heather, I really appreciate this. It's always great connecting with other Berks County folks, and especially ones who are kind of on that same path in a different way, leaving the confines of little old Berks County and going out and spreading their wings however they can. So it's a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it too.
You bet.